My company Artichoke exists to do things which are frankly a little bit mad. The project you just saw the film on is a project called One Another, which was the idea of an artist, one of our most eminent artists, Antony Gormley, the sculptor. And it took place in Trafalgar Square, right in the heart of ceremonial London, a quite bonkers place to do a project like that, in 2009. His idea was that a different ordinary person selected from right round the UK should occupy the space on the empty plinth in Trafalgar Square for an hour at a time, 1 hour each, 24 hours a day, 100 days and 100 nights, without an interval. Now that is, to anyone used to putting on shows, that is like mounting 2,400 individual 1 hour shows with no interval and no break. And that is a terrifying prospect for any of us who are used to putting on shows in nice, safe spaces like theatres. Artichoke doesn't put on shows in theatres. We put on shows in the streets, in public spaces. The thing that's really common about all of them is that they all take place in the public domain. And that, of course, is part of the reason why they're so very difficult to mount. We mount things like this, the Sultan, La Machine, which was a show involving an enormous spider. We took it to Liverpool in 2009 as part of their Capital of Culture celebrations. And astonishingly, the people of Liverpool loved the 50-foot-high monster, which was this spider. We founded the company 6 years ago. We're a creative company, and the thing at the root of all our projects is that we work with artists to create these extraordinary spectacles. They're all mad, they're all a bit ambitious. The first show we mounted was an event called the Sultan's Elephant. It happened in 2006 in the centre of London. We work with artists because artists see the world in a completely different way for the rest of us. They have a unique perspective which makes us, in turn, look at our surroundings, our world, in a new way. And that's really why we mount events of this kind, which transform the way we all look at public space. They transform the way we look at ourselves and the way we feel about the world. So crucially, the events are all created by artists. Their work's often challenging, it's thought-provoking, it's sometimes moving, it's always entertaining. And the artists that we choose to work with are those who communicate with the widest possible audience. We don't believe in the cerebral, in the difficult, in artists whose work needs to be seen in the context of an art gallery or concert hall. What we try to do is to pick the very best artists that we can find, but those who can communicate across very, very broad audiences. We work outdoors. People are always incredulous when we say we choose to work outdoors. It rains all the time. I own quite a lot of Gore-Tex now. I think one of the reasons why we choose to work outdoors is that although it's not as safe and it's not as dry and it's not as comfortable or predictable as working inside a theatre or a gallery space, what you have is the opportunity to reach a very broad audience who are not alienated by the very idea of going inside a building, which many people find absolutely terrifying, an impossible prospect. And also you get this fabulous backdrop to your work. So the architecture, the city itself becomes your stage, your set, your costumes. And actually what it does when you place work of this scale in the context of a city is to make people look at that city as if they've never seen it before. Of course, it can be very difficult. I think what's very noticeable is that public spaces, or spaces that we think of as public, are often not public at all. So Canary Wharf, for example, isn't a public space. You might think that you can sit on the grass in Canary Wharf. You will be moved along very, very, very quickly, particularly if you have a beer bottle in your hand. Even in Cambridge, I live in Cambridge, and it's tantalising, isn't it, that you look into the doors into the gates of most of the colleges, and I would love to do things in those colleges, but most of them are out of bounds. You can't even walk into them most of the time. They're not public spaces. We're also very used in our cities, we're all very busy. We rush around. We heard earlier about being too busy. We're plugged into iPods, we're on the phone. We don't look up, we don't look at our surroundings. We certainly don't commune with our fellow man. and woman in the streets, there tend to be places which are all about traffic. They're all about shopping. They're all about business. And they're not at all about community. And I think one of the things we try to do in our work is to change that expectation and persuade people to look about them. One of the other things about our work is that we find that we have to remove a lot of things in order to make it possible to work in the streets. We take, for example, in Britain, probably more than anywhere else, there's an awful lot of what I now know of as street furniture, which means bollards and islands and traffic lights and CCTV cameras are everywhere. When you try to do an event in a public space in England, it's very difficult. There are CCTV masts all over the place. We once had, over the elephant show in London, we had to not only prune the trees to the height of a 50-foot high elephant, which takes some persuasion, but also we had to remove a whole row of traffic lights from Haymarket, I think it was, and traffic islands and an enormous CCTV mast. So, in fact, in the case of Liverpool, we once had to remove a roundabout, a full roundabout, which it had been there for years and years. It was outside the entrance of the Mersey Tunnel. It had full planting, trees, all sorts of things on it. But there was no space in Liverpool. There was no, as indeed there aren't in many of our cities, there aren't those gathering spaces which we're used to seeing in squares in Berlin, in Paris, and so on. There are big squares. In England, quite a lot of cities don't have big squares. They don't have places, perhaps they don't want us to gather. But in Liverpool, anyway, in order to create the room for the finale of the show, we had to remove the roundabout. And interestingly, Liverpool has not put back the roundabout, only a demountable structure, because they recognised, having removed it, that there was a valuable space which they could use for events, popular celebratory events, and they've chosen not to put it back. Often we have to close the roads to traffic to accommodate our events, and quite often that's the most controversial thing of all. When you think about it, the streets are very often closed, not only for roadworks, but they're closed for demonstrations, for sporting events. 26 miles of streets are routinely closed for marathons all around the country now. It's not unusual, is it? But in London, when we were trying to mount the Sultan's elephant, trying to close 4 miles of streets for, how long was it, 3 days, not all the time, was incredibly controversial, difficult, took us months and months of persuasion. Particularly, it was very difficult to persuade the powers that be that we should close the street which runs from Admiralty Arch to Buckingham Palace, the Mall. Quite often we are told when we're in the process of planning an event that it would be much, much easier if we were to take that event and put it on in a nice, safe park, or yes, Battersea Park always seemed to be the one that came up when we were planning the elephant show. Or a park, Sefton Park in Liverpool, that's where you need to do your shows. I think only when you produce your events right in the centre of the city with the maximum disruption possible do you actually create the circumstances in which those events have the maximum effect. And certainly, one thing that people say to us again and again is that they felt that the streets belonged to them again, that they reclaimed them in some way, where they weren't expected just to stay on the path, they weren't expected simply to that the streets were the preserve of the dreaded car and bus and taxi, that the hugely enjoyable experience of sauntering down the Mall with an elephant and your family and a whole lot of people you've never met before was one of the most moving and empowering things about those shows, at least so people tell us. Of course, we have to work. I quite often find myself in meetings with mostly men in uniform, to be honest. We're very, very unusual in that Artichoke was founded by me and another woman, Helen Marriage. In fact, our entire team at the moment is female. And I suppose part of the reason we're able to get these things passed is that we're very, very unusual in those situations where most of the authorities who have the permission to say, that have the power to say yes or no, are men. And they're rather taken aback. I think they quite often think we're entirely mad when we describe a fairy tale involving a spider, for example, or say we want to close Piccadilly. But In fact, I think they come on board because they don't want to be the ones that say no. Quite often we find that, and again and again, we find that people start off from a position where they're looking for a way to say no to you. And in fact, in the end, they stop saying why, stop asking you why, and they start saying, well, why not? Why shouldn't the streets be able to host an extraordinary artistic event just as much as a theatre or a concert hall or a gallery? And why should the streets be allowed to be closed for marathon runners, but not for the arts? I suppose the truth is that we don't do these things on our own. We only do them with a huge amount of goodwill, huge amount of help from particularly the authorities. In London, the man that I always think about as having been utterly crucial in our managing that elephant show was the guy who ran special events for London buses, who went so far beyond the call of duty as to be, I mean, in the end, actually, he not only found us a bus for the little girl giant to ride on, but he drove the bus, had it repainted, insisted that he brought a conductor on, had a new blind for the front of the bus made that said Elephant and Castle, all without any request from us. And actually, it's those individuals who suddenly decide that they don't want to be the ones that say no or stand in your way, and they do want to be part of something that they can tell their children and their grandchildren. I suppose what's most exciting for us is that events that we mount in the streets have the opportunity to engage a public who would not normally ever consider themselves to be an art lover. The One Another project that we saw at the beginning, recruited huge numbers of people to take part in it, many of whom were already fans of Antony Gormley or interested in the idea of the democratisation of that space in Trafalgar Square. But there were also huge numbers of people who were doing it for all sorts of different reasons. As you saw, people who wanted to draw attention to a particular cause, or people who just felt it would be their 5 minutes of fame, or 60 minutes of fame in that case. Gormley, in fact, it was a very ambitious project. In fact, when he first approached us with the idea, he wanted the project to last for an entire year. We said no quite a few times at that point. He wanted the project to involve people from all walks of life, from all around the UK. He wanted people to be able, I think what he really wanted, at least he said this at one point in a meeting, terrified me. He wanted 60 million people to apply for a place on the plinth. No pressure. And what he really wanted to create was an artistic idea that would have the whole of England, or the whole of the UK, I should say, talking. I think we achieved some of that. We had, in the end, 35,000 people apply to take part. 2,400 of them, of course, got a place. But there was an enormous buzz around the project, an enormous amount of discussion, 1,600 newspaper articles, a huge wall-to-wall press coverage, television, radio, etc. We managed to convince the Archers to carry it on in their storyline as a way of creating some profile for the project. And I think what it really seemed to do was to become the kind of project that people were talking about, not only people who were already interested in artistic ideas. There were also nearly 9 million hits on the website during the course of the project from 800,000 unique users, each one spending an average of 6 minutes on the site. And those things are really unheard of. And the reasons why, for an arts project that is, the reason why that was made possible was because we worked with Sky Arts in a partnership which began with that project, on trying to create ways in which a much broader public and a public all around the world could engage with that project. So that meant creating a website, for example, where everything that was happening on the plinth was streamed 24 hours a day. Now that makes it the longest outside broadcast in history, apparently, a 2,400-hour outside broadcast, with scarcely a break. It very seldom went down. But also the opportunity for people to be commenting, discussing, There was a blog which became incredibly popular. We had, I think, 55,000 comments posted on the site during the course of the project. So all those things, they were people engaged with it all around the world, not only in London. It wasn't only about the live event. In fact, it almost wasn't about the live event at all. It was about a community of people talking about this idea. I suppose, but when I think about why we do it, I think it's not even really about the artist, so of course that matters hugely. It's about the audience. We do it because it makes people happy. There's a book by an American academic called Barbara Ehrenreich. It's called Dancing in Streets. And in her book, she talks about public celebration, the fact that we seem to lose certainly in terms of the arts, we've lost the ability to celebrate publicly in the streets, except perhaps at football matches or when there's some political triumph or whatever. She says that we all have a basic human need to celebrate together, to experience things collectively as communities. And I think that you can see that is true when you look at the effect of some of the events we've been proud to produce in Britain, particularly, I suppose, the feedback that we get afterwards, the sense of joy, the faces of some of the people that you saw on the slides, who are looking with wonder and amazement at something that they would not normally have expected to see walking around the corner in London or on a street corner in Durham. And I think it's that really motivates us, spurs us on when things are very difficult. I'd just like to close with a comment which Baroness Mackintosh, Janista Mackintosh, who used to run the National Theatre in the Royal Opera House. She's now sits in the House of Lords, and after the Sultan's Elephant, she chaired, I think, a debate on the future of the arts in the House of Lords. And she said, "No amount of statistical analysis will capture the value of the elephant's visit or why it will be remembered. And there will be no way of demonstrating any causal relationship between it and the social, economic, or educational outputs. What were all these people responding to? I think they were recognizing that art, like cuckoos and spring, makes you feel better just by being itself." Thank you.